So I am Dr. Amy Grosso. I'm the Director of Behavioral Health Services for the district. I started this position in January. Before that, I was part of the Future Readiness team and am so excited to be tonight presenting with some of their Future Readiness seminars. Tonight we will be talking about how to cope with the school year of unknowns. And I just want to be very clear that tonight is really focusing on that coping part, like how do we handle it? How do we work with our children about a year of unknowns? I'm not going to be talking specifics about what the district is doing with virtual learning or in-person learning. I don't talk about technology because you really don't want me to. Really focusing on that emotional and mental well-being of all of us during this time, because I think parents and families alike, we can all use of how we can really cope, because it is a year unlike any other. So I sort of have a graphic to start us with. You know, in March, we started on this crisis, and I think for many of us, we didn't expect that in October we would still be here. I know I didn't. You know, we went on spring break, and it's just continued to be a year of new and changing and nothing staying the same, and really not knowing what the next step is going to look like. And that's really hard for all of us. And so to be able to process through this and for us to really talk about how we're going to cope with it, I'm going to go through a few different things tonight. And please feel free to utilize the chat feature. I'll try to answer questions as I go along. Margie Davis, who's part of Future Readiness, is here as my sidekick to be able to help me if I'm missing some questions. So please feel free to utilize that. But today we're really going to talk about what's the importance of letting ourselves feel our emotions and our feelings and what's going on with this year of new and year of unknowns. Where they're going to talk about the importance of empathy, realistic expectations, and the importance of perspective. And hopefully through us going through these different aspects tonight, it will help you be able to get a better understanding or look at what we're going through in maybe a different way. I never claim to have all the answers, and I've never claimed to say, 1, 2, 3, these are the things you can do to cope perfectly with this year of 2020, because I think it's a very personal thing and we all handle things differently. So hopefully through tonight you get some new skills and new perspective of how we do things, of how to look at this year. I'm very big, my background's mental health counseling. I was a mental health counselor for a number of years. So I'm very big on how do we let ourselves feel what we're feeling. And to realize that our emotions and our feelings, our children's emotions and feelings, they're not to be fixed, they're to be felt. And I have found, I'm a parent of a 7-year-old, he's in 1st grade at Old Town Elementary, but I have found that not only do I struggle with not wanting to feel emotions that make me feel uncomfortable, I really struggle when my kid starts to feel those emotions. And emotions that make them uncomfortable, and emotions that aren't the warm and fuzzy ones that we all like. And so while I struggle feeling those myself, then also struggling of how my child is feeling those. So I want you to think about for a second. I want you to think of what are those different feelings that you enjoy and welcome. What are emotions or feelings that you're like, yeah, I like feeling those. And if you want to, you can put those in the chat. What are different feelings you enjoy and welcome? You know, is it happiness, calmness, joy? Thinking about just for you yourself, what are those different feelings that you welcome? And then I want you to think about what are different feelings that you avoid? Sadness, fear, grief, jealousy. So which feelings and emotions do we welcome and which do we avoid? And then I want you to think about and ask for yourself, how do you avoid these? keep busy, or just act like they're not there, avoid them, blame somebody else, avoid be eating. Yes, avoid by eating, like I'm eating my emotions. I love that. Judgment, do I judge what I'm feeling? Do I blame others? I know I blame my husband sometimes for emotions and feelings I have that really aren't his fault because I don't want to face them myself. So I want you to take this a step further. How do you stop your kid or your kids from feeling their emotions? Do you try to keep them busy? Do we judge it or tell them they have no reason to feel that way? Blame something else or have them avoid it? And realizing that emotions aren't good or bad, they're just what is. And if we don't pay attention to them, they come out in ways we don't want them to. And I really feel like since March, there's two primary emotions that I think are hard for us to process and look at that drive a lot of what's happening. And I think are roadblocks for us to be able to cope with this year of knowns in a as healthy way as we can. And I feel like those emotions are grief and fear. And so we're going to take a little deeper dive and looking at both of these during this time. So I like to look at definitions. So grief is the normal and natural emotional reaction to loss or change of any kind. Oftentimes we think of grief as only when we lose somebody by death. While that is a complete form, we grieve that. Grief is normal and natural emotional reaction to loss or change of any kind. And I want you to think about, since March, how much loss and change has there been for all of us? I sometimes want to say that it might be easier to actually think about those things that haven't changed than to think about what has changed. And this is true for us, and it's also true for our kids. I also want to point out that it says grief is normal and natural. If it's natural, it doesn't mean we control if we feel it or not. It just happens to us. So research and a lot of time has taught us that there's often different stages of grief. And it doesn't mean we're going to feel all of these as we've had loss or change, but it maybe will help us understand where we're stuck or where we find ourselves within grief or where our child does. So is it denial, not pretending this isn't even happening, or anger, right? I go to anger a lot. Like, I'm mad at this situation. I'm mad that we have to be this way. I'm mad that school can't be like it's always been and that I depend on it to be, and that my child's not having those experiences. Do we try to bargain, or do we find ourselves in depression? And have we struggled to get to the point of acceptance and even finding meaning in what's going on because we don't know how to get out of this cycle? We don't know how to work through the grief we might be feeling about the year. And does that stop us from being able to cope with this year of unknowns? Because a year of unknowns means there's a lot of change and there's a lot of loss. I've often think that some of us struggle to get through grief and get to that point of acceptance and finding meaning because fear is blocking our way. That we find ourselves stuck in grief, but it's also we're stuck with fear. So what is fear? Fear is an unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that someone or something is dangerous, likely to cause pain, or a threat. So let's look at this definition. First, I just want to say it says it's an unpleasant emotion. So it's already, we want to avoid it. And it's caused by the belief that someone or something is dangerous and likely to cause pain or a threat. Fear can be our friend. Fear often keeps us safe, right? It keeps us safe at different times, but fear, if not checked or processed, can overwhelm us and it can hamper us. And sometimes if we don't look at it, we can end up with anger, blame, and judgment, when in reality, what's underneath it is really fear. Am I blaming others for what's going on? Is there a judgment of what's going on? Is there anger? And when is it that I'm really underneath it all? There's just a fear. And what is that fear? Is it a fear that I'm not going to be a good parent? A fear that my child's not going to know how to cope with this year or be able to get through it? Or a fear they're losing part of the experience? So what are some of those fears that are happening? You know, I constantly fear, am I doing enough to help my son at this time? So what is it for you? And I often find as parents, when our kids are feeling these unpleasant emotions, we want to just fix it for them, right? Like, let me just fix it, tie a bow on it, and everything's good. But what if our job really isn't to fix it, but instead to sit with our kids? That when they are fearful or they're grieving or they're sad, that instead of trying to fix them, that we're willing to sit with them in that. I've done a lot of sessions last year and the year before with some of our high school students on just mental health in general, and talking to them when I say, what's the one thing we as adults and parents and staff can do? And they said the one thing is just to listen to us and to understand. They didn't say to fix, they just want us to understand. And I feel like this is where empathy really comes in. Empathy isn't about fixing something. Empathy is about sitting and being able to be there with someone. And so a huge part of empathy is, how do we listen? And listening to understand instead of listening to respond. And we're going to watch a short video that's on this, and I want you to think about interactions with others, especially with your child. Do you find yourself more on the empathy or the sympathy?
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So I want you to think for a second about interacting with your child or just with others, or even interacting with yourself. And do you find yourself more on the sympathy side or the empathy side? And it's not that there's anything wrong with you, right? Like when life is going fast and these things that we think by saying, oh, it's okay, everything's fine, like at least in trying to let them know that it could be worse, that isn't empathy, that's sympathy. But an empathetic response isn't trying to fix anything. It's basically sitting with someone. And so wondering if part of this year of coping with unknowns, especially helping our kids cope with the year of unknowns, is practicing empathy with them and practicing listening instead of judgment and talking. And it's important we do that because it's through empathy that we're able to have grace, and grace for ourselves and others, grace for our kids. I've gotten asked, like, my kid's sad, how do I make them happy now? And honestly, we're gonna be sad some right now. We're in a pandemic. Life isn't how we want it to be. And it's hard to always just feel upbeat with that. So of course we're gonna have times we're sad and we grieve or we're afraid. So as adults with our students and our kids, how do we use empathy to let them know they've been heard and we're with them? And that we don't judge how they feel because it's feelings and those are normal and natural. I also feel like when we are able to have that empathy and grace, that part of it is also the importance of having realistic expectations. I've said this since March, that I really believe managing expectations of ourselves, of others, is a key for promoting mental health during these times. Life has drastically changed, and so much our expectations. We want to have the same expectations, but it can't happen right now. So I want you to think, what were your expectations of life before March? And how did those need to change? And what were your expectations even in August? And how do these need to change? It's hard to know what to expect and to have realistic expectations when things change and we don't know what's in front of us. And is that where fear comes in? I took these screenshots about a month ago. One's from an NBA game and one's from a Major League Baseball game. And realizing if this is where sports look like today, it's a reflection on how much life does look different at this moment. And to remind us that we do have to have different expectations for ourselves and others. So how do you focus on having realistic expectations? And it's through having those realistic expectations that I think we're able to have a perspective that can help us cope with this year. How much time do you spend focusing on wants versus needs? It's okay to want things, but what in essence do I really need? Also, how much time do we focus on what's outside of our control versus what's inside of our control? And if you're like me, I have to constantly remind myself to focus on what's inside of my control instead of focusing on what's outside. An exercise that I lead teachers to do, students to do, is to draw a circle on a piece of paper, and inside write everything that's inside of our control. And on the outside, write what's outside of our control. So right now, what's outside of our control is that we're living in a pandemic. What outside of our control is other people's decisions. So those are the things you can put, or however other people view us, or their expectations on me. And then focus on what's in my control. So often we focus more time on what's outside versus what's inside. And it could be for a lot of different reasons of why we do that. Fear, anxiety, stress. Throughout this last 7 months, I've really had to ask myself why I focus more on what's outside of my control than inside. And for me, I'm not saying this is everybody, I focus more on what's outside of my control than inside, because focusing on the outside doesn't require anything of me. It's easy to blame others or critique others or judge others' decisions or what they're doing. And that doesn't really require much from me. By me focusing on what's inside of my control, it requires me to look at me. It requires me to take responsibility of what I can be responsible for. And that might mean that it requires me to make some changes. So like I said, I don't know if that's true for you. I just know I've had to take a hard look in the mirror of wondering and looking at why I focus on what's outside of my control versus inside. And I daily have to remind myself to focus back inside my circle. Did you know we have 525,600 minutes in a year? We have 43,800 minutes in a month, 10,080 minutes in a week, 1,440 minutes in a day, and 60 minutes in an hour. And you get to decide how you want this time to be spent. That's what's inside of your circle, is you deciding, are you going to let yourself process through emotions and really look at grief and fear, those emotions we normally try to avoid? Are we going to approach this time with empathy and grace, or judgment, or trying to fix everything? You get to decide what you do with this time. And so I want you to reflect. In 10 years, when you reflect back on this time, I'm being positive that in 10 years we won't be in the same situation. How do you want to remember it? How do you want to remember this time in your life? How do you want your kids to remember it? And even harder, how do you want your kids to remember you during this time? A few months ago, my son and I were talking and trying to focus on like being grateful for things we have. And he was just saying he was glad of how much more family time we've had because of the pandemic, and being together more. And I said, that's right, we've had so much more time together. And he looked at me, he said, yeah, when all this is over, it's going to be like, we'll say like, let's pretend it's COVID so we can have more family time. And I think that was a really wake-up call for me of how do I want to remember this time? So often I focus on it's hard, we're all these things, worrying about everything in the world and fearing these things. And here is, it's the innocence of a child, right? Of being able to say, I'm going to miss this time because I'm missing time with my family. So how do you want to reflect back on this time in 10 years? And how do you want your kids to remember this time? Viktor Frankl is one of my favorite authors of all time. He wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. He was a psychiatrist who lived during the Holocaust, but not just during the Holocaust. He lived through 3 concentration camps. And his philosophy on life came from that. And he said, when we're no longer able to change a situation, we're challenged to change ourselves. Makes you think, once again, what's inside your circle versus what's outside of your circle. When we focus on what's inside of our circle, we're challenged to change ourselves.